So welcome back to the spinal cord. And we discussed pathways of the spinal cord, various tracts, ascending, descending tracts. The spinal cord is surrounded by a particular kind of bone. What is that called? It starts with a V. It starts with a V. What is the bony encasing of the spinal cord? Let's see, I'll just scroll down here. Vertebrae, good. Yes, the vertebrae. And their injuries to the spinal cord can be serious in that if the soma of a spinal neuron is damaged, then it is irreparable. If it's slightly damaged along the axon, especially closer to the end, then it is reparable, but it does take quite a long time. There are two diseases of the spinal cord. One is called poliomyelitis, or polio. It's caused by a poliovirus. Poliovirus. It's generally spread by fecally contaminated water. And it causes by damaging neurons weakness in the muscles. Because the neurons can no longer innervate the muscles. The polio vaccine has eradicated polio from most of the world. In some more impoverished areas, there may still be polio, but it is very rare. And it is a case of a vaccine that eradicated a widespread disease. And one thing I wanted to say, it's about herd immunity, is that is the main purpose of a vaccine is to provide herd immunity to a virus. And right now, of course, we're concerned about the COVID virus, and natural immunity, so immunity that just occurs by infection or infectious immunity, is something that is very rarely achieved. So in the past, it's been the vaccines that have created the herd immunity. Another disease is called ALS. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Sclerosis is a condition, it occurs in different parts of your body to tissue where the tissue is replaced by connective tissue, more or less scar tissue. ALS. It's also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Lou Gehrig was a baseball player in the 20s in the United States, and he contracted the disease. It's he was a great baseball player, and he hit a lot of home runs, and he was competing with Babe Ruth. I don't know if you've ever heard of Babe Ruth. Anyway, he was a pretty famous baseball player back in the 20s. But unfortunately, he contracted the disease and he had to stop playing, of course. And so apparently about 5 to 10% of causes of ALS are genetic. Other causes are still being investigated. It isn't fully known what the causes may be. But the reason it occurs, it's due to the astrocytes. Remember the glial cell, astrocyte. Due to astrocytes failing to absorb a neurotransmitter called glutamate. Glutamate. And so the glutamate builds up and then it becomes toxic to the neurons and it damages them. So glutamate builds up and becomes toxic. So as we said before, there are many substances which in normal amounts or small amounts are non-toxic, but in large amounts can be toxic. So this leads to paralysis and muscle atrophy. So Stephen Hawking had ALS as well. He lived a very long time. I don't remember his age. I think he died last year or the year before, Stephen Hawking. He was informed that he didn't have long to live when it was diagnosed, I think maybe in his 30s. But he lived a long time. So let us look at the anatomy of a nerve. So I'll write some notes about this in a moment. Here is the nerve. A nerve is a bundle of bundles, really. Within the nerve are bundles called fascicles. So this is one fascicle here. And the fascicle itself contains a bundle of nerve fibers or axons. And each stage has its own covering. The epineurium covers the entire nerve. The perineurium surrounds a fascicle, and the endoneurium separates the individual nerve fibers or nerve cells. And blood vessels penetrate only to the perineurium. The nerves are very demanding of oxygen and glucose. So there is a large blood supply, but that glucose and oxygen has to diffuse into the area where the cells have access to it. So let me write some notes about that. Nerve. Oops. If you hold it down long enough, it turns into a straight line. A nerve is, it's a cord-like structure, really. Bound by connective tissue. It may just have a few fibers. It may have a million. I'm going to use fibers, and that is the axons of the neurons themselves. The epineurium is the connective tissue that surrounds the nerve. Which is dense, irregular, fibrous tissue. So it's not loose, it's dense, but it's densely packed loose connective tissue, if that makes sense. So it protects the nerve. It's quite strong. It protects the nerve from stretching. And injury. A fascicle are bundles of neurons, or bundles of the axons of neurons. Bundles of axons surrounded by the perineurium. But the perineurium is just squamous cells. So about 6 layers of overlapping squamous cells. So leaky enough and penetrable enough for oxygen and glucose to easily get to the neurons, the axons themselves. The endoneurium. The endoneurium is loose connective tissue surrounding each axon. And of course, each axon is wrapped in myelin. So in the peripheral nervous system, which is what we're talking about right now, that myelin is produced by Schwann cells. And the outer layer of the Schwann cell is called the neurolemma. So the neurolemma is the outermost the outermost coil of the Schwann cell. And nerves have a very high metabolic rate. A high metabolic rate, so they need a plentiful blood supply. So I'll just show you that picture once again. I'll bring up the writing again in a moment. So looking at the nerve itself. So this is the spinal nerve here. There are 2 roots, dorsal branches. We're going to be talking about branches in a moment. One of those branches is the dorsal root, which includes the dorsal root ganglion, and another branch is the ventral root here. The ventral root is your motor root. And each of these branch into what are known as rootlets. So these rootlets enter the spinal cord, and these rootlets exit because they are the motor neurons. Okay, I'll leave that there for a moment. The question is the myelin produced by Schwann cells or composed of Schwann cells? Both. So the Schwann cell extends its plasma membrane to wrap around the axon, but it remains attached. So the outermost layer, that's a good point. The outermost coil of the Schwann cell includes the nucleus. So it remains as part of the myelin sheath, the very outermost layer. Okay, moving on. The anatomy of ganglia. So in the peripheral nervous system, a bundle of cell bodies or somas is called a ganglion, singular, ganglion. Ganglia is plural. It has a different name in the central nervous system. So this is the peripheral nervous system. And there are quite a few bundles, quite a few ganglia. So it's a protrusion that is medial to the spinal nerve. And it includes, so here you can see drawn out a unipolar sensory neuron. So it's a unipolar sensory neuron. And here is the cell body. But in the case of the dorsal root ganglion, the fibers pass through without synapsing. So in this case, they do not synapse in the ganglion. Instead, they synapse in the spinal cord or the medulla. Let's see. Synapse occurs in the spinal cord with the second order neuron, sensory neuron. So the peripheral nervous system or PNS, a bit of review here, has two kinds of neurons. Sensory or afferent and motor or efferent. The sensory neurons, how many neurons in a sequence? How many neurons in a sequence of the sensory neurons that ascend the spinal cord? I'll get to your question there in a moment. 3, sometimes even 4, which occurs in the cerebrum. And the motor efferent neurons have 2. The question is, the ganglion is quite solid. There is extracellular fluid in the ganglion, as there are surrounding cells in any part of the body, but it is quite dense. It is dense. They're densely packed cell bodies. So, sensory. I had something else to say about that, just a moment. So motor sends signals from the central nervous system to muscle and glands. And sensory neurons transmit signals from receptors in muscle and glands to the central nervous system. In general, some nerves are purely sensory. Some nerves are only motor. They carry only motor neurons. But some nerves are mixed. They have both sensory and motor neurons within them. Some purely sensory nerves, for example, the optic nerve is purely sensory, the optic nerve. A ganglion is a bundle or a cluster of cell bodies. Outside the central nervous system, in the peripheral nervous system only. So we looked at a few of the numbers of neurons. Oh, I see. Yes. So the pathway of sensory neurons from receptors to the cerebral cortex requires 3 sensory neurons in a row. The first order neuron, sensory neurons, begins at the receptor, ends in the spinal cord or medulla. The second sensory neuron begins in synapses with the first one and goes to the thalamus. And the third order neuron goes from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So it's just the number of neurons that occur in a series transmitting a signal from the body or gland to the cerebral cortex. So that's a really good question. And motor neurons have 2. One that goes from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord, and then the second one extends from the spinal cord to somewhere in the body. Good questions, good questions. So let's look at branches. There are 8 cervical spinal nerves, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. Each nerve branches. So the branches that we've looked at already are branches known as roots. So this is the dorsal root, that's a branch. This is the ventral root, that's a branch. And those are branches of the nerve adjacent and attaching to the spinal cord itself, the dorsal root and the ventral root. But after they merge, they branch again. They start branching, it seems almost uncontrollably, but there are some main branches. So I'll just write that down. The dorsal, the dorsal and ventral roots merge and then branch. Distally of the merge. They branch into the dorsal ramus. Ramus is just another word for branch, really. The dorsal ramus, the ventral ramus, and the meningeal branch. So those are the branches that extend. The dorsal ramus innervates dorsal body, muscle, and skin. The ventral ramus innervates ventral, skin, muscle, and limbs. The arms and legs. The meningeal branch re-enters the vertebral canal and innervates the meninges. The vertebrae themselves and the spinal ligaments. So something slightly different occurs in the thoracic region. In the thoracic region, the ventral ramus forms what is known as an intercostal nerve. That innervates skin and intercostal, that's that's between the ribs muscles that contribute to breathing. They also innervate the internal oblique muscles, stomach muscles, external oblique, and the transverse abdominal muscles. All the other outside the thoracic region, all the other ventral rami form nerve plexuses. And nerve plexuses are networks of nerves that branch and merge. The term innervate means that the neuron sends a signal to a particular place. So if it innervates a muscle, it causes the muscle to contract. If it innervates a gland, it can cause the gland to release hormones. It can also innervate, it's a sort of a looser term too, it can innervate a whole region. So another word for that, I think the text uses another word, services or provides. I'm not sure, I think the text does use a different word, but innervates means that's where those neurons go and that's where they send their signal for an effect. So that's where the effectors are for that particular nerve. That's a good question. So I don't know if you've heard of this. Have you heard of shingles? Shingles, unpleasant condition. Those are skin eruptions along the path of a nerve because the nerves are inflamed or the area of the nerve is inflamed. And it's caused, interestingly, by the varicella-zoster virus, which is the chickenpox virus, which one can get as a young person, and it remains for life in the dorsal root ganglia. So it just remains dormant. And the only time generally, but not always, that it can happen is usually after 50, and if the immune system is somehow compromised. There's no special treatment for it. It just heals spontaneously. It's thought to be caused by immune compromisation, is sometimes caused by stress, or other diseases or conditions. It can be treated, it's treated with aspirin for pain and steroid treatment for inflammation, to reduce inflammation. There is a vaccine for shingles. Yeah, I got it. Cost me $200 and I'm fine with that. Shingles are very unpleasant. I know some people that have had them. They're quite painful. So What are these plexuses of which I speak? Let's look at what it might look like. So this is the cervical plexus. From vertebra 1 to 5 of the cervical nerve cord. There's branching and merging. So for example, the hypoglossal nerve that comes from somewhere different comes from the cranium, and that merges at this point. Let's see, there's the phrenic nerve in this particular plexus, and that goes to the diaphragm. So damage to the phrenic nerve can lead to loss of breathing and can be fatal. So the plexuses are somewhat complex, but the thing to know is the fact that they branch. Anastomose means merge repeatedly. The cervical plexus starts from C1 to C5. It supplies, there's another word for innervates, supplies the neck and phrenic nerve to the diaphragm, for example. The brachial plexus in the armpit, C5 to T1, supplies or innervates the upper limb, some of the shoulder and neck. You should definitely remember this part of the plexus. So put a big star on this slide. The lumbar in the lower back, L1 to L4, supplies or innervates the abdominal wall, the anterior thigh and genitalia. The sacral plexus in the pelvis originates from L4, L5, S1 to S4, supplies the remainder of the butt, the glutes, and the lower limbs. And the coccygeal also innervates the lower limbs. So I'm not going to go into each plexus individually. Rather, I'm going to assign a video to watch. Wait, I just need to admit somebody here. I'm going to give you a video to watch about plexuses and spinal nerves in general. And then I'm just currently looking for a good one of a particular plexus. I think I found one for the brachial plexus. So I just started looking for that today, but I will find a good one that you can watch because they are fairly complex. But in particular, do remember the origin and what part of the body is supplied or innervated by that particular plexus. So spinal nerve injuries. There are some nerves that are particularly vulnerable to injuries. Radial nerves, for example, and sciatic nerves are vulnerable. So the radial nerve, I'm giving these to you by way of example. So the radial nerve passes through the armpit, the axilla. And as such, it can be compressed by crutches. It causes something known as crutch paralysis. And that can be seen sometimes with something called a wrist drop. A wrist drop. The sciatic nerve. It's generally best for people not to put their wallet in their back pocket because that's where it can be compressed. Sciatic nerve, it's in the hip, thigh. Trauma to this nerve, it's a very long nerve, causes a condition known as sciatica. It's a sharp pain that travels from the gluteal region along the posterior side of the thigh to the leg and the ankle. And 90% of the cases, however, are from a herniated disc. Which is a vertebral disc protruding from the spinal column of the lower spine. But it can be also caused by a pressure from a pregnant uterus, during pregnancy, the later stages of pregnancy, hip dislocation, and also sitting for long periods of time in the same position. Yes, and don't sit on your wallet. Thank you, common. It's common in pregnancy. Do we need to memorize parts there? I will let you know what you need to know. So in particular, you should know, sorry, excuse me, the origins, I don't have any water, the origins and the areas of innervation. So you don't need to memorize every nerve in every plexus. However, you should choose one of the plexuses and be able to recognize it and even know some, at least, of the nerves in that particular plexus. So I'll write that down. So study one plexus in depth and the nerves involved, and the names of those nerves and their function. Let's put some of the nerves involved, their names and function. Okay, so it's up to you to choose it. You'll be seeing a video on the brachial plexus, so that would be a good one to choose. The structure of a nerve plexus. Yeah, so there's the cervical plexus. Let's see, I'll just choose one. The phrenic nerve innervates the diaphragm. Let's see. The transverse cervical nerve innervates the skin of the neck. So those are some examples of nerves in the cervical plexus. The brachial plexus, it looks a little more complicated. It really isn't that much more complicated. I'll write a couple of notes about the brachial plexus. So as you can see, there are many nerves involved. Some of them are fairly obvious. The dorsal scapular nerve may have something to do with the scapula. Axillary nerve, something to do with the armpit, for example. So some of them are obviously named. The radial nerve innervating the radius, the ulnar nerve innervating the ulna. So these are all the effectors that are innervated by the brachial plexus. So some general notes on the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus is formed by the ventral ramus, as they're all formed by ventral rami, of nerves from region C4, cervical 4, to thoracic 2. It passes over the first rib into the axilla and innervates the upper limb and muscles of the neck and shoulder. So the type of innervation is such that it gives rise to cutaneous sensation. So the brachial includes those sensory nerves, muscle contraction, so voluntary skeletal muscle contraction, and a proprioception from joints and muscles. Yeah. So the brachial plexus, here's a dissection, shows where the nerves are here. The lumbar plexus originates from L1 to L5. The lumbar plexus. Sensory and motor innervation of the skin, joints, and muscles of the abdominal wall. Male and female genitalia. I can write that down as well. So also sensory and motor innervation of the skin, the joints, muscles in the abdominal wall, abdominal muscles, the thigh, male and female genitalia, the scrotum, the penis, and the labia majora. Now what else? The medial leg and foot, the anterior muscles of the thigh, the extensor muscles of the legs, specifically in the knee joint, and adductor muscles. Those are the muscles that pull them together, the adductor muscles of the legs. So it's one of those things where, you know, you delve into the details, you probably won't remember the details, but if you look into the details, you'll be able to understand in the future the function of these various plexuses. And it's not always a matter of memorizing every single detail, but it is a matter of looking into the details so that you can even understand better the general concepts, the general concept of plexuses.
Maria, could you scroll back up instead of scrolling down while you're talking? Sorry.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So the last ones are the sacral and coccygeal plexuses. So these are the origins. The superior gluteal nerve innervates the gluteus minimus and medius. So there are several muscles in the buttocks. The inferior gluteal nerve is a motor nerve and it innervates the gluteus maximus as an example. What else? Let's see. The posterior cutaneous femoral nerve. This innervates the skin of the lower lateral buttock. The anal region. The upper thigh. And calf. In males, the scrotum. And in females, the labia majora. So remember the areas that are supplied by the various plexuses, and also that these are sensory and motor nerves. Now, reflexes, somatic reflexes, that is a section of the chapter that you will use when you write the report later on about reflexes and reactions. So I'm not going to lecture on that part of this chapter. Okay, so I'd like to end there. Thank you very much for watching.